Good morning, everyone. How are y'all? Good, all right. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Talia, for that introduction. This is not a group of people that I get to speak to a lot. So I'm very excited because I have a lot on my mind. So as Talia mentioned, I run diversity for Facebook, and that means that it's my job and that of my team to build strategies which Facebook will use to increase the diversity of our own workforce. The underrepresentation of certain groups in our workforce is something that is not unique to us. It's something that you will see all over corporate America. And when we talk about underrepresentation, of course, there are some groups which are more underrepresented than others. So always within that categorization, you will see Blacks and Hispanics at any level, in any job function, at any company, I would say, generally in America. Of course, I'm accepting the type of companies would fall under our supplier diversity program, which are minority owned and run, and there are some companies that are making progress. But generally, you will see this same underrepresentation everywhere. And so we're very focused on trying to figure out how we address that. In most places, when you talk about diversity, people run for cover. Everybody thinks you're coming at them with some mandatory training that nobody wants to do. When we talk about diversity at Facebook, we talk about cognitive diversity. And again, one of the reasons I'm so excited to be in this crowd is because I know that a lot of you will know the research around cognitive diversity, and I don't know if there are Michigan people out there, but I have to give you a shout out for Scott E. Page and what he has done for my life and all of our lives with his research on cognitive diversity. So we think about that. We're very focused on how do we get as many people as possible on as many teams as possible with different ways of seeing the world, different sets of information and skills and background, because we have complex problems to solve. Because of course in the research it shows that if you have simple problems, you don't need as much diversity. But we would posit that connecting the whole world is one of those complex problems that you might want people with different ways of thinking, approaching. So for us, it's a fundamental, right? There's no add-on. There's no, it's nice to have diversity. It is so critical for what we are trying to do for our mission. So my experience in all of that, as Talia said, I've done a couple of things in my life. Have taken this kind of a path. Through it all, social justice has been the thread for me. So I've been a human rights lawyer. I've worked on civil rights. I have, I worked for over 10 years focused directly on inclusion and diversity. I have represented unions a lot in industrial courts, so working for workers' rights. And most importantly, for what I'm going to talk about today, the biggest credential is that I have been Black and a woman my whole life. Dwarfs everything else. So the reason I say that dwarfs everything else is because there's some stuff you know, right? There's some stuff you know even if you can't prove it. So I know that for underrepresented people, there are two things they have as basic needs. The first is they need to know that they're not crazy. And the second is they need to know, or at least to believe, that they will be supported. So if I say they need to know they're not crazy in a room of people who are underrepresented in corporate America, it'll be like church. Like they'll all go, uh-huh, right? Everybody knows what I'm talking about. In mixed company, I might have to explain what that is. So I'll give a couple of examples. In the workforce, it might show up like this. You might see a whole bunch of people who look like you at the bottom levels, and people who don't look like you at the top. And you're like, am I crazy? Like, how come they all get there and I don't get there? It might be a missed promotion, or it might be a manager you don't just fit with. There are academics who call it something in the water, right? Something's going on here that I know has to do with my identity, but I can't put my finger on it. Some people call it second-generation bias, right? There is something going on. I'm not crazy. In your personal life, it comes up as well. I lived, Talia had mentioned that I worked for a number of years at a global law firm doing diversity there as well, and spent 2 of those years in our Geneva office. And I remember when we first moved to Geneva, applied for an apartment, right? And it's an application process. It's quite thorough. Like, you submit a resume, so they see all of those things she talked about, where you went to school and Rhodes Scholar and this and that and then, you know, financials, et cetera. And then they decide if they're going to accept you in their apartment. And my family got accepted in this apartment, and we moved in, and I have a 1-year-old son, and, you know, everything was fine. And then there was a knock at the door about a month into being there, and a woman came by, and she said that she had been the woman who had been cleaning that apartment for 15 years, and she wanted to know if we wanted to keep her on. But the first thing she said was, when I opened the door, "Oh." And I was like, "Oh, who are you?" And she told me who she was and why she had come, but then she couldn't help herself, and she said, "You know, I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you here." Well, she doesn't know me, right? So I said to her, because I have been black my whole life, "You mean you didn't expect to see a black person here?" And she said, "Yeah, really didn't." And then she went on, and she gave me more information. She said, "You know, because the embassy it's Geneva, right? So there's lots of international people there." She says, "The embassy of the Congo wanted to rent this apartment, and the owner said she would never rent to black people. So I didn't expect to see you here." I cannot tell you how pleased. I hugged that woman, right? My white in-laws were aghast. How could they do that? And I said, "What do you mean? How they do this all the time? She's given me a gift," right? I was so pleased that she actually said it. Because otherwise, they leave you thinking you could be crazy. Was it something about where I went to school? Was it something about where I work, right? She had said it. No, she was the cleaning lady. She went her way. When the next day, the owner showed up and said, "You have to leave my apartment," and I said, "Why? Is it because I'm black?" She said, "Of course not. I have nothing to do with it. I've decided I don't want to rent anymore," right? They don't ever tell you. It's never that direct anymore. We're not in a situation like we used to be where it was okay, in fact, sanctioned by the law, right, to do this kind of thing. We're not any longer sitting at counters at Woolworth where somebody can say, "We're not going to serve you." So it happens in this way where there's something in the water. And it's so, this is the awful thing about it, is that it leaves you feeling like you could be crazy. So when I say to you, these 2 basic needs, it is so fundamental when supporting people that you do that. I always first say to people, the first thing I want to tell you is you're not crazy. We could go and investigate, and we could figure out, you know, what happened in this particular, but I want to let you know that what you're feeling is because of something real. So you're not crazy. I was in the South this week, in South Carolina, North Carolina, and in Greensboro, I went to this lovely museum. It's the International Museum of, I think it's called Human and Civil Rights. And the museum is in the original Woolworth where the first sit-in happened. And so you get there, and it's just like, whoa, and you're just like the waves of it, right? And I recommend for everyone, like everybody here is smart, and you read lots of books, and you're all intellectual and academic, but there is nothing like physically being proximate, being immersed, right? Like, first of all, knowing people who are different from you, that's great, start there. And then be there, be in these places which have these really vivid reminders that we're not far off from that. So even for me, going to this Woolworth, it's impactful, right? You see that it wasn't long ago, and then they say, well, yeah, everybody talks about Woolworth, but Crest across the street is where they then beat people who were doing the sit-ins. And you're like, big sign is there, Crest. And then inside of the Woolworth, there's a Coke machine. And it was a Coke machine that was in bus stations and all over not long ago. And on one side of the Coke machine, so it's just like a box, right? And you put your money in. And on one side of it, where you put your money in, it says Coke's 5 cents. And on the other side of it, no, inside this machine are all of the Coca-Colas you can buy, right? The Cokes are not coming from different sources. It's one box. But on the other side of it, there's a slot where it says Cokes 10 cents. And that slot was for coloreds, and this slot was for whites. Like, the impact is so real. You paid twice as much. The poorest people, right, paid twice as much for the same Coca-Cola coming from the same box as the richest and the most privileged. And when you see that encapsulated in that one machine, it really gives you a good context for then all of the other downstream effects of everything that you experience when you are supporting underrepresented people. So the fact is that these are the conditions under which we operate. The problem is that the operating systems that support us don't seem to recognize that. Do not seem to recognize that the reality of marginalization is the invisible thumb on the scales. Now, you build scales. You all measure stuff, you weigh stuff, right? You calibrate. So you have the opportunity to build the right scales, to address things as they really are, not as we pretend they are, or not as we don't even tune in to how they are. It is possible to conduct your life if you're not surrounded by these people who are underrepresented, so there are not many of them in any of your environments. It is very possible to conduct your life as if this doesn't happen, right? When we talk about controlling for things, we control for and we weed out race, right? Let's control for race, when in fact, you should be considering race, considering racism and how that impacts people's ability to perform, to exist, to be received, to be recognized. All of it matters. So how do we do that, right? How do we recognize that? How do we build a different operating system that does recognize that? So let's start with the definition of people analytics. Some people define it as an approach to business operations and management that gets away from gut decisions and prioritizes action based on large sets of data. At Wharton, you might just abbreviate it to evidence-based talent management. That sounds fabulous. It is exciting for somebody like me doing my kind of work. It's about solving problems, long-standing problems I could solve with that, right? Here I am trying to work on these problems that human beings have had forever that we've not found solutions for, about opportunity and about, majority versus minority group struggles and unconscious bias and all of these really, really hard things. And along comes a sophisticated science born in my field, the technology field. So I am like going crazy with excitement at what this could provide me. The upside is that this science promises to deliver something where we can finally move from making decisions based on intuition to predictions based on data. It's brilliant. But there is a catch. And the catch is that when it comes to making data-informed talent management decisions regarding underrepresented people, we run headfirst into this paradox. In order to make these decisions, you need data, statistically significant data, from which you can draw confident conclusions. The issue for me and for those of us focused on underrepresented populations is that when we ask for this data, do you know what we hear? Sorry, your ends are too small. Can't tell you. No help. For myself and others in the industry, when we want to cut employee data in certain ways, when we want just Black or Hispanic information, when we want insights on these groups separate from the aggregate of their functions or level, we hear it whenever we want that thin cut. Same answer. The N is too small. So for me, that's the N word for me in analytics. Drives me crazy. I am trying to identify the most critical problems to solve for the most underrepresented groups, and to do so using evidence-based approaches, but I'm having to deal with the fact that the number of these people is too small for the science to kick in the way I hear it does, when you have big data sets. So it's almost like they're saying to me, if there were more of you, we could tell you why there's so few of you. So now who sounds crazy? Right? That sounds crazy. And this problem is everywhere. So it's when I'm trying to get those thin cuts of data on my population so I can identify problems and support. It's also in the research on this subject. First of all, I mean, there's no competition. There is so little research done around Black and Hispanic populations, right? That just needs to change. Then even where there is, here's the type of thing that happens. The Ascend Foundation, love them. Ascend is a foundation that is focused on Asian advancement in the workplace. And in 2014, they did a phenomenal study. What that study did is it looked at the impact of race versus other characteristics on your ability to progress from the professional level ranks to the executive ranks. They compared data from 5 companies in the technology sector, and they found that white men and white women were 150% more likely to become an executive compared to their Asian counterparts. And that while both race and gender are factors in the Asian glass ceiling, the impact of race is more than 3.5 times the impact of gender. That is amazing. They were like that cleaning lady for me in Geneva, right? This is stuff that you know, but I don't have any numbers around it. I can't prove it to other people who say, well, show me, right? I think there's lots of other factors that are keeping you back. Here, they actually put numbers in. They created something called the Executive Parity Index, right? A number by which race was impacting people's progress. Brilliant. The problem is, it took more than 2 years of research aggregating. So at that time in 2014, they did this with 5 companies. And they could tell us for Asians how it impacted them. They could not tell for Blacks and Hispanics. Because you know why? The N is too small. It took 2 more years of research for them, aggregating 13 manufacturing and software companies with several 100,000 employees before they could attempt to answer the same question for Blacks and Hispanics. And they found, are you surprised, that for Blacks and Hispanics, race did have a more significant impact than gender. And if you are particularly interested, Hispanic women have the lowest chance for advancement, with Black women not far behind. There have been hundreds of articles written on the value of diversity to companies, with hundreds of suggestions for what you do: mentorship, managing bias, right? Professional development programs, all great. But try to find some which give metrics that prove how or to what degree, if each of these interventions impacts your progression if you are Black or Hispanic. Very difficult. So we have the raw numbers. We know how many of us there are in any industry, right? You have your EEO1 reports. And then we have anecdotal evidence. People talk about their experiences. But we are missing that deep understanding of how minorities build their careers despite persistent marginalization. So as I'm experiencing all of this, right, trying to get the data, trying to get the benefit of people analytics for these most underrepresented people, I say, well, is this only happening to me? Again, like, am I crazy? So I decided to do a little bit of research, radical stuff, pick up the telephone, and I call other diversity heads at other companies in my industry. And I asked them the same question, right? When you ask for data around Blacks and Hispanics, you know, what do you get back? What's happening? And I didn't know how they would respond to those phone calls. But every single one acted like they were like, finally you came, right? Somebody is asking, I've been dying to talk about this. And all of them said the same thing. Generally, they tell me the N is too small. So it's challenging. But we're resourceful. So nobody was going, okay, you can't help me with the data, then I'll just do nothing. No, they're building programs and they're taking chances and they're trying to identify problems the way they can and they're building solutions for them. They're relying on professional experience, intuition, common sense, and a knowledge of the reality of marginalization. So the irony is that they are relying on the things which go against the raison d'etre of people analytics. This was supposed to take all of this out of it. Brian Tippins, who is the head of diversity for HP, I said to him, what do you do when you can't get help from people analytics? And he says, well, look, ideally, you do want the combination of great quantitative and qualitative data to be able to identify your problems and build solutions. But he said, but there's nothing the data will tell us that we don't already know as black people. And I have been an African-American man for 16 years in non-diversity roles. I know what's up. And he's going to build solutions to what he knows is up. I called Sandy Hoffman. She is the head of diversity at LinkedIn. And I said, Sandy, what do you do? And she said, it's like sniffing. I was like, sniffing? And she's like, yeah. You know, you sort of sniff out an issue when the data analysis can't help because they say the N is too small. It's almost like a spidey sense that comes into play because you're so attuned to the issues. We have this whole science, and people are having to rely on spidey sense. People analytics was meant to take intuition out of the process, and that is great for the general population. It is not so great for people who don't register as big in big data. I have spoken now to colleagues at companies with 300,000 people and colleagues at companies with 60 people. And regardless of the size, it is the same issue. We do not take into account the impact and experiences of underrepresented people. We don't cut the data the way we need it. We do not get the feedback that we need scientifically to make the decisions that we want to make. So, the truth is that as you hear that, you may feel like, oh my God, this is just depressing. What do we do? And I want to talk a little bit about what do we do. But I want to give you some context for how this shows up, right? I said I was in the South this week, and I was at a great company in South Carolina. And I went to visit that company because I'd heard that they had 40% of their staff was black and Hispanic. And I was like, whoa, how did you do it? So I went to see them. And one of the interesting things they told me was that they noticed that when underrepresented people did their own self-reviews, they would rate themselves consistently, they've been tracking this, 30% below where their managers rated them. That was the average, an average of 30% lower than where their own managers rated them. And interestingly, the more underrepresented they were in a field, the lower they rated themselves. By that I mean, if they were in the sales department, they would rate themselves, it's average 30% below. If they were in engineering, they would rate themselves even lower. I mean, this stuff, right, would mess with your head. What they also found is that it didn't matter by level. So senior people who are underrepresented were doing the same thing. And also, majority people, white men, consistently rating themselves 10% above where everybody else thought they were. This is what I mean about marginalization being the invisible thumb on the scale. In many cases, the impact of racism means that many managers themselves undervalue the work and contributions of underrepresented people. At this particular company, those people were lucky. They were lucky that what was going on was that their managers were giving them their due, but what we were seeing reflected in them in their own self-reviews was the internalization of all of these years of being categorized as less than, right? Anybody who's studied stereotype threat, you know that that's what happens. You start to believe the hype. But at least at this company, which is very focused on equality and fairness, and by the way, has a CEO who is an underrepresented person, that's not to be discounted as why this company is this focused. The managers were giving them their due, but in most places, the managers themselves would reflect this racism and this buying into the stereotype, and they would be undervaluing these employees, right? So if you come to do a textual analysis, you'll say, yeah, the manager gave them a, less than meeting standards, but they also gave themselves a less than. So yeah, we think this is good evidence qualitatively that they probably are less than the standard. But everybody is caught in this same loop, right? Everyone has drunk this Kool-Aid. This Kool-Aid has been pouring for hundreds of years. No algorithm can fully capture the impact of being the only Black or Hispanic woman on a team. No set of numbers can capture the manifestation of never knowing if you're good enough and generally believing you are not, because that's how people like you have been categorized for ages. A Latina colleague of mine broke it down for me this way. I'm going to read you exactly what she said to me. She said, when we do our employee surveys, the Latinos always say they're happy. But I'm Latino. I know that we are never going to rock the boat. Saying the truth is too risky, so we'll say what you want to hear, even if you sit us down in a focus group. I also know that those aggregated numbers, where there are enough of us for the N to be significant, don't reflect the heterogeneity of our community. For someone who grew up in Latin America from an upper middle class who is light-skinned, they probably are happy and comfortable indeed. For someone who is darker skinned and grew up working class in America, they're probably not feeling that same sense of belonging. But remember, the numbers come back for Latinos and say they're happy. You take them in the focus groups and they say, we're happy. She said, I'm going to spend time and effort trying to build the solutions for the ones who I know are at a disadvantage, whether the data tells me that there is a problem with all Latinos or not. She knows the reality of marginalization, but the formula which her people analytics team is using to determine if there is a problem worth solving among Latinos doesn't have that input. So, again, you're probably going, what the hell do we do? I agree with the proposition that people analytics can bring us value. That gut isn't enough, right? I think it's great. But we have to create a new operating system, a version of people analytics that works for small data sets, for the marginalized, for the underrepresented, while knowing that volume is not our North Star. I think there are a combination of three things that we can do. The first is there's work to be done on the quantitative side. People analytics uses traditional benchmarks to determine the minimum N. The minimum N that you need to make a confident decision. So the first thing I want you to do, wherever you are, wherever you work, is to question where that benchmark has been placed. Think honestly. If you had developed this science with underrepresented people in mind, would those benchmarks be where they are, or would they be different? I have one colleague who said, I've just moved the N. Yeah, they tell me we need 20 or 30. No, I'm just using 10. And I said, what did your people analytics people say about that? She said, I didn't tell them. Right? She's just going to do it. So if you were doing it, if you were starting over from scratch, would you need as many as that? Where is the true standard? Where is the benchmark? Okay, and if you've done that, then think also, in the absence of large N's, could you figure out the standard of confidence always? So rather than simply saying to someone like me who asks, rather than simply saying the N is too small, sorry, I can't help you, shouldn't you always give your findings along with a level of confidence so that decision makers have something to work with? That should be routine. So that is something you could do tomorrow, right? Start doing that. Second thing is, as a rule, we should combine the quantitative with the qualitative. Many companies do this already. They do interviews and focus groups, or you analyze text. But we have to go further. We have to question the certainty of the information gathered. Because, as I've described, there's a different way in which we have to operate. There are different issues impacting us. And the reality of marginalization means that even as you look at that qualitative data, I want you to keep that in mind. That should be the operating system in the back of your mind all of the time. So let's figure out how our qualitative data is flawed and get deeper in there and think more about improving our methods of data collection as well. We have to get past the first, it's fine, everything's fine, and not accept it, or not accept when other people say, that person's just not a fit, right? They're just not up to standard. What's going on in their mind? What's happening in their scales? And then this issue of this operating system, this different way of being, what does it mean? It means weighing the reality of marginalization, weighing it in your qualitative and your quantitative research, making that reality the foundation of this operating system when you are looking at people who are from underrepresented groups. You might say, but I don't know that reality. I don't have that experience. I don't have that training, so how am I going to weigh it in? My suggestion would be, if you're at a company that happens to have a diversity team, lean on them. Build things together. If you have a great HR team who has worked with underrepresented people, lean on them. If you have employee resource groups, lean on them. If you don't, get consultants. Seek the knowledge out. You are knowledge seekers and you are learners. Seek the knowledge out. Read more. Know more people. Come out of your own comfort zone and understand what are the factors that are impacting this data that you are collecting and you're seeing and you're analyzing and you're processing and you're advising upon. The ultimate goal is to get to a place where you are not relying on me to help you through that process. It is to get to a place where we have democratized diversity at our companies, where you have that knowledge. You may not have lived the experience, but you have acquired the knowledge that there is this impact from marginalization. If everyone in the people analytics function had that knowledge, had that greater understanding and expertise with all people, we would be better able to support people. And if we can agree that this is important, it's an important factor that's been missed in the equation, nobody talks about it, that we could figure out together how to build that into the system and how to weigh it. We need you, and right now, you need us. These very underrepresented people who are not there enough for the end to be significant, because that experience matters. Diversity work is literally and unapologetically about supporting and growing small ends. But people analytics was not developed to help solve small end problems. And we can change that together. We need a kind of money ball for diversity, right? Let's develop those tools and approaches intended to analyze data that focus on traditionally underrepresented people, not just majority people. And I want to be clear that all of this is possible because of people analytics, because of the people in this room. In every company, including mine, where we have gone and said, we need help to understand this, they have been willing and able. It's not them, it is the science or the approach rate or the operating system that is failing us all, because it just didn't have us in mind. But think of what value could be brought to this world if we broaden our focus to include the most underrepresented. So what I am challenging us to do is to find another route to certainty with people at the center, all people, who may be small in number, but are far from crazy and need support. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was fascinating and upsetting as well. As a researcher, it's funny. I've been in the position of that low end, And not only as a researcher, but also, also as a consumer. So we did a faculty survey, and we had the same problem, which is when we were trying to understand the experience of underrepresented minority, and I was running the faculty survey, and I said to myself, I have a small n, I can't do this, right? But the one thought that I do have about this to the challenge, so you gave a challenge to us as a field, and both as researchers and as practitioners, but I would argue that I'm gonna throw a challenge back to the practitioners, which is that there is such a perception that every company is different and special, and that the research that has to be done at Microsoft is different than Google, than HP, and that's even within industry. And God forbid you give people research that was done in manufacturing to a technology firm.
Yep.
They will, I'll say, I have the N,
Yes.
and they will tell me, it's not our N.
Yes.
And so I would go so far as to say, and I know that you have an amazing team of people who know this stuff, is that where we are standing right now in this level of research is, you are correct that in the kind of thin slices, we don't have the N, but when we put the N together, either in terms of meta-analysis or even just places that there could be enough, we do have the N to inform a lot of these things, but nobody wants to listen to it because it's not theirs.
Yes.
And so is there, I'm thinking that what could be so exciting at minimum is, at least within an industry, is getting the, well, it'd be nice to just hear the literature that exists in the world.
Right.
But if
And first of all, to have more literature that exists in the world.
Yes, although, well, and that's the beauty of something like this that we're doing here with the people analytics, because what would be really wonderful is if we could, if we could get, for example, a consortia in the tech industry, and there are so many researchers who are interested in doing this work, and, get that in, and yes, it will differ between Google and Microsoft, and, but it would push us so far. And it's this kind of forum, I think, that allows us to do that.
Yeah.
So I wonder, what is your view about whether something like that could happen?
So I think that there is a general human condition. I always say that half of the world's problems are because everybody thinks they're special.
Right.
And you're absolutely right, right? We have to be sort of adult about where are we unique and then where might we not be. And then there is a tenet that we have at Facebook, which is that done is better than perfect.
Right.
I think we just need to get around that, right? To know that having something, so it's, when I said that it would be good to do simple things, like even if you still, let's say, okay, you say I can't reset my bar for what my N needs to be, but at least then, when you are communicating that, say, look, there were 3 of them, but I did find this, I have this level of confidence, right? That's not perfect, but it's something.
Yeah.
So I do agree with you that that everybody wants to know for them.
Right.
For them exactly, what does this mean, or how does this show up? And we should do a better job of remembering that we're not that special. Let's see what, how does this apply broadly? I have to say that I am lucky that I went to a company that Sheryl Sandberg had been the COO of for years and had done so much research around women particularly. But when these things would come up, right, somebody would say, we should have the whole company should have to do the implicit bias test. And she would say, bias has been proven. We know people are biased, right?
Yes, yes.
So it's that
So
kind
that saved that, yeah.
Yes. I mean, we do it in our managing bias course. If you take the managing bias course, we ask you to take it. But we're not going to make it mandatory for the whole company. We're like, no, we believe there is bias.
Yeah.
We don't need to prove to you as an individual that you have it. But when you talk about aggregating, that's why I love this work that Ascend, right? They looked at across companies, and then they compared manufacturing and software.
Right.
And so, yes, it's not ideal,
Right.
because you could say the people who are in those manufacturing jobs are not, we wouldn't hire them, we don't really have that workforce, but it tells you something. So I absolutely agree with you. that done is better than perfect here, and that you learn.
Right. And well, and so taking questions from the audience, and as you know, so I'm actually taking questions. They're just here instead of you raising your hands, as you know. And one of the questions sort of relates to this, which is that as you talked about like what you want to know, what would you want to know that you're not getting the answers to, and how does that relate to inclusion?
Yeah.
And how do you measure inclusion as opposed to just sort of, you know, diversity and representation?
Yeah. So every company does some version of a pulse survey where they are testing for inclusion.
Right.
And you want to know, you know, intent to stay, connection to what you're doing, you know, your manager, like all of these questions, which impact whether employees are going to perform well and then whether they're going to stay long and whether they're going to rise. And whenever that data comes back for all of these companies and they want to cut it smaller, because they want to know now, as the example with the Latino population. So the data comes back and it says, no, the Latinos are really happy here. And then she says, but I know that they're not. And within there are all these parts that are not the same. But what you're giving me back is this one thing. And you're saying, yeah, there's no problem. And I know I'm not crazy. Right? And people are talking in their employee groups. Or if you happen to be one of the underrepresented people in a company, I promise you that you're almost keeping office hours. People are finding you. They're coming to speak to you. They want to speak to somebody who looks like them, who they know is not going to judge the merit of their work on the basis of an experience that they're having. So they don't want to speak to a majority person who may say, you know, there's so many sort of terms which are like red to a bull for an underrepresented person. But one of them, which used to be said a lot, was you have a chip on your shoulder. So when you're sensing that, how come the other people on my team are getting great opportunities and I'm not really getting it, and I think I'm doing well, and on paper he says I'm doing well, but why not? Like, does this have something to do with who I am, my identity? And they will seek us out and they will speak to us. So this Latino colleague of mine at another company, she says, I know that they're unhappy because they're coming to talk to me. But when I ask my data analysts what's happening, they say, no, everybody's good. And then you're left with, well, what do I do? Everyone has, you know, even at big companies with a lot of money, you still have a finite amount of time. So you are deciding, what do I spend my time solving? And if my data analysts are telling me that's not a problem, then I don't need to solve it. And then you start to see this creeping up of your attrition numbers. And you're like, funny, I thought everybody was happy. So there's so much that's missed in there. And as I said, I called so many people, and it's all across.
And do you think that companies would be willing, going back to that first point, let's say, for example, there are studies. Let's say somebody does the Hispanic study, right? And they manage to find a company that they can get in and do that, and they do that study, and it's published. Can you, at Facebook, use that study to say, so it doesn't have to be at Facebook?
Not for us. As I said,
right.
I mean, I'm lucky that I'm in a company where my leaders are very much we're focused on doing important things, in adding value, and in being efficient. So that increases the efficiency at which we can solve the problems. So no one is going to turn their back on an efficient approach, right? Something that aids us in efficiency, which is what that would do.
Right. And I think one thing that we talked about earlier backstage was wanting to try to leave these conversations hopeful. And I think that while your talk beautifully hit this issue of how we deal with the data, there is one question that's broader from the audience that may, again, kind of help us leave more helpful, that's not directly related to the data, which is they're asking, what tips do you have to move the dial on this issue of support and for underrepresented groups in places where the managers are struggling to see the value of doing so? And also there was a particular question, which was, as a white male, how do I lend credibility to the work I may do in diversity? And I realize these are broader, but it might leave people with something to go out with.
Oh God, absolutely. So the first thing you should know is that, you know, support, you can do support on a macro or micro level. There are people in front of you every day. anytime you interact with somebody who is underrepresented, get over yourself and your own identity and think about theirs. So if, again, I could talk about these operating systems at the back of your mind. If you have that going on in the back of your mind, and you are the white man, you don't feel so self-conscious about that. What you're thinking about is them. I know when I was interviewing at Facebook, a white man who was on my interview loop kept, he was asking me all these questions about diversity and stuff, and I stopped him and I said, why do you care so much? And he said, because I'm tired of going to my team meetings and seeing only white people looking back at me, right? I loved that. And I love the fact that this man cared enough to get involved and do something. Your being concerned to support is so much more important than your having the solution.
The right thing.
Right? So that's why I said it's two things they want. The first thing is they want you to say to them, you're not crazy. And the other thing is they want you to say to them, I'm going to support you however I can.
Yeah.
And we may not have the answer. This is stuff that's been going on for hundreds of years. But I am going to support you however I can. So when you ask for tips for support, the first is admit that you mightn't have the answers, but you are a willing and able and supportive colleague.
Yeah.
Tell them they're not crazy, and tell them that together you all will find out how you can do this most. You may get to done rather than perfect, but it's something better than where they are now.
Well, and I think that the mantra for them this morning is for everybody to go out and say to each other, you are not crazy. So thank you for giving us that vocabulary and a wonderful talk.
Thank you.